Now, to understand Catharism, we need to recognize how it stood out as a significant Christian movement between the 12th and 14th centuries in southern Europe, particularly in northern Italy and southern France. Catharism, often seen as a quasi-dualist or pseudo-Gnostic movement, was rooted in the idea of purity, as suggested by its name derived from the Greek word katharoi, meaning the pure ones. The Catholic Church condemned the cathars as heretics, which led to severe repercussions. They were ruthlessly persecuted during the Albigensian Crusade and the subsequent medieval Inquisition, leading to their near eradication by 1350. Thousands of cathars were killed, hanged, or burned at the stake, often without consideration for age or gender. Cathars, also known as Albigensians, derived their name from the city of Albi in France, where the movement initially gained a foothold. They identified themselves as good Christians and held the belief in two gods, a benevolent God of heaven and a malevolent God of this age, which many equated with Satan. They viewed the physical world as the domain of this evil God and believed that human souls, seen as sexless angelic spirits, were trapped in it. According to their beliefs, these souls would undergo reincarnation until they achieved salvation through the consolamentum, a form of baptism given at the moment of death, allowing them to return to the good God as cathar perfect. Initially, Catharism was disseminated by ascetic leaders who set few rigid guidelines, leading to variations in practices and beliefs across different regions. The first chronicled mention of Catharism was in 1143, and by 1150 the Catholic Church had already denounced their practices, particularly the consolamentum ritual. Pope Innocent III, at the start of his reign, made numerous attempts to eliminate Catharism, employing missionaries and pressuring local authorities to act against the sect. The situation escalated in 1208 when Pierre de Castelnau, the Pope's legate, was murdered after excommunicating Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, accused of being too lenient towards the cathars. This assassination led Pope Innocent III to declare de Castelnau a martyr and subsequently launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209. The nearly two-decade-long campaign significantly weakened the movement, and the ensuing medieval Inquisition ultimately eradicated Catharism. Due to the lack of central organization and the regional differences in beliefs and practices among cathars, as well as the scarcity of primary sources from the cathars themselves, some scholars have debated the extent of the threat they pose to the Church, and some even question the very existence of a cohesive cathar movement. The origins of cathar beliefs remain somewhat mysterious, but many theories suggest a connection to the Byzantine Empire, with ideas spreading from the First Bulgarian Empire to regions as far as the Netherlands. The cathars were significantly influenced by the Bogomils of the First Bulgarian Empire and possibly the Paulician movement in Armenia and eastern Anatolia. The term Bulgarians was often used interchangeably with Albigensians, hinting at their association with the Bogomils, who were known as Friends of God. There is substantial evidence to suggest a transmission of ritual and ideas from Bogomilism to Catharism. Their doctrines showed resemblances to those of the Bogomils and Paulicians, as well as earlier movements like the Marcionites, Manichaeans, and Christian Gnostics of the early centuries AD. However, drawing direct historical connections between these groups based solely on perceived similarities would be speculative. John Damascene, in the 8th century, mentioned an earlier sect called the Cathari in his book On Heresies, referring to a group that rejected second marriages and the possibility of penance after baptism. These Cathari, likely the same as the Novatians mentioned in the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 305, were required to accept communion with those who had lapsed in faith to be integrated into the mainstream church. Due to the perceived threat of Cathar doctrine, much of their writings were destroyed by the papacy. As a result, most historical records of the Cathars come from their opponents. This has led to ongoing debates about Cathar ideology, with accusations of speculation, distortion, and bias on both sides. Few Cathar texts remain, like the Ritual Cathar de Leon and the Book of Two Principles, which provide a glimpse into their dualistic theology from the perspective of some Albanenses Cathars. By 1143, identifiable historical Catharism began to emerge, with the first confirmed report of a group with similar beliefs active in Cologne. A significant event in the institutional history of the Cathars was the council held in 1167 at St. Felix Lorgais, attended by local figures and the Bogomil leader Nikitos. Catharism primarily flourished in the Rhineland cities, northern France, the Languedoc, and northern Italy during the mid to late 12th century. It achieved its greatest popularity in the Languedoc and northern Italian cities, surviving in a much reduced form in the Languedoc until around 1325, and in the Italian cities until the Inquisitions of the 14th century finally extinguished the movement. And in Cathar cosmology, the universe was understood through a dualistic lens, much like other Gnostic traditions. They believed in two creator deities. The first was the benevolent creator of the spiritual realm as depicted in the New Testament, and the second was the demiurge of the Old Testament, who created the physical universe. This demiurge, often referred to as Rex Mundi, or King of the World, was identified with the God of Judaism. The Cathars saw the cosmos as a battleground between the forces of good and evil. While some Cathar communities held a mitigated dualism, where Satan was a rebellious servant of the true God, others adhered to an absolute dualism. This more extreme belief posited that the good and evil gods were twin entities of equal power and importance. According to the Cathars, Rex Mundi created all visible matter, which was inherently tainted with sin. Human beings, in their view, were actually angels seduced by Satan. After a heavenly conflict led by Michael, these angels were trapped in the material world as punishment. To escape this cycle of suffering and reincarnation, one had to renounce the material self completely. Failure to do so meant enduring endless reincarnations on the corrupt earth. Zoe Oldenburg, a historian, compared the Cathars to Western Buddhists, as their understanding of resurrection was akin to the Buddhist concept of rebirth. And Cathars revered Jesus Christ and considered themselves his true followers, calling themselves good Christians. However, they denied his physical incarnation and resurrection. Their view of Jesus was more in line with Docetism, where Jesus was seen as a divine being whose physical form was merely an illusion. They believed that Jesus' physical body might have been an appearance given by the Virgin Mary, another angel in human form, or that he was born of a woman without male involvement. For the Cathars, the resurrection was not a literal event but a symbol of reincarnation. They rejected the Christian symbol of the cross, viewing it as a tool of torture and evil. They also saw John the Baptist, whom they identified with Elijah, as an evil figure sent to mislead people with the false sacrament of baptism. The Cathars' understanding of Jesus diverged significantly from the mainstream Trinitarian view. They leaned towards non-Trinitarian modalistic monarchianism in the West and adoptionism in the East, sometimes combined with Docetism. Some sources, including Bernard of Clairvaux's biographer, accused the Cathars of Arianism, and some scholars see traces of Arianism in Cathar Christology. Certain Cathar communities believed in a spiritual realm created by the good God, known as the land of the living. They thought the physical world was a corrupted copy of this spiritual realm. Under this belief, the history of Jesus as told in the Bible occurred in the spirit realm. In the material world, a false Messiah, a physical Jesus, and a material Mary Magdalene existed. The true Jesus, however, influenced the physical world by inhabiting the body of Paul in a manner similar to the harrowing of hell. This view was recorded by the 13th century chronicler Pierre de Vos de Cernay, and some Cathars told a version of the Enochian narrative in which Eve's daughters copulated with Satan's demons and bore giants. This narrative included the deluge, which was provoked either by Satan, who was displeased with the demons for revealing his true nature, or by the invisible Father attempting to destroy the giants. The Holy Spirit was sometimes seen as a single entity, but other times as the collective group of unfallen angels who had not followed Satan in his rebellion. Cathars believed that women's sexual allure hindered men from rejecting the material world. Despite this, some Cathar communities made exceptions. In one version of their teachings, the Invisible Father had two spiritual wives, Kalam and Hulabam, identified with Ohola and Aholaba, and provoked the war in heaven by seducing Satan's wife, or vice versa. Cathars who believed this thought that having families and sons wouldn't prevent them from reaching God's kingdom. Some Cathar communities also believed in a day of judgment. They thought that when the number of the just equaled that of the fallen angels, believers would ascend to the spirit realm while sinners would be cast into everlasting fire along with Satan. Cathars followed a pescatarian diet. They abstained from cheese, eggs, meat, and milk because these are all byproducts of sexual reproduction. They believed that animals carried reincarnated souls and thus forbade killing any animal life except for fish, which they believed were produced by spontaneous generation. In many ways, the Cathars prefigured Protestantism. They denied transubstantiation, purgatory, prayers for the dead, and prayers to saints. They also believed that scriptures should be read in the vernacular, and to the Cathars, killing was abhorrent. Consequently, the perfecti abstained from all animal food, sometimes exempting fish. They avoided eating anything considered a byproduct of sexual reproduction. War and capital punishment were also condemned, which was unusual in medieval Europe. Despite this, the sect had armed combatants ready to engage in combat and commit murder on its behalf, as evidenced by the assassination of the papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau, in January 1208 in Provence. The Cathars viewed reproduction as a moral evil because it continued the cycle of reincarnation and suffering in the material world. Charges of heresy against suspected Cathars were often dismissed if the accused could show they were legally married. Despite their negative views on the Old Testament God, the Cathars did not exhibit significant hostility towards Jews as people. In fact, Jews likely had a higher status in Cathar territories than anywhere else in Europe at the time. Cathars appointed Jews to public offices, further angering the Catholic Church. Despite their condemnation of reproduction, the Cathars grew in number in southeastern France. By 1200, many towns in the region were almost completely populated by Cathars. When Bishop Fulk of Toulouse criticized the Languedoc Knights for not pursuing the heretics more diligently, they replied, "We cannot. We have been reared in their midst. We have relatives among them and we see them living lives of perfection." And the Cathar Church of the Languedoc had a relatively flat structure, distinguishing between the baptized perfecti, who were also known as bonhommes, and ordinary unbaptized believers, or credentes. By around 140, they had established a liturgy and a system of doctrine. They created several bishoprics, first at Aves around 165, and later in Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Agen. By 1200, these four bishoprics were well established, and during a lull in the Albigensian Crusade around 225, the bishopric of Rheims was added. Bishops were supported by two assistants, a filius major, typically the successor, and a filius minor, who were further assisted by deacons. The perfecti, or spiritual elite, were highly respected by many locals, leading lives of austerity and charity. In apostolic fashion, they ministered to the people and traveled in pairs. Catharism provided women with significant opportunities for independent action. Women were both believers and perfecti, capable of administering the sacrament of the consolamentum. Cathars believed that a person would be repeatedly reincarnated until they committed to self-denial of the material world, with a person able to be reincarnated as either a man or a woman. The spirit, described as immaterial and sexless, was of utmost importance to the Cathars, leading them to see women as equally capable of being spiritual leaders. Women accused of heresy in early medieval Christianity included those labeled Gnostics, Cathars, and later, the Beguines. Like the Gnostics before them, Cathars assigned significant importance to Mary Magdalene's role in early Christianity. Her vital role as a teacher contributed to the Cathar belief that women could serve as spiritual leaders. Women were included in the perfecta in significant numbers, with many receiving the consolamentum after being widowed. The Cathars revered the Gospel of John and saw Mary Magdalene as perhaps even more important than St. Peter, the founder of the Church. Catharism attracted many women with the promise of a leadership role that the Catholic Church did not allow. Female perfects were required to adhere to a strict and ascetic lifestyle, but could still have their own houses. While women perfects rarely traveled to preach the faith, they played a vital role in spreading Catharism by establishing group homes for women. In these communal homes, women were educated in the faith, and these women would go on to bear children who would then become believers, growing the faith exponentially. However, Catharism was not completely equal. For example, later French Cathars believed that one's last incarnation had to be experienced as a man to break the cycle of reincarnation and achieve salvation. Toward the end of the Cathar movement, the faith became less egalitarian, and women perfects were sometimes excluded. However, this trend was limited, as Italian perfects continued to include women.